Hello everyone, Simon said. Simon says here. So today I want to talk about the spawn mechanics of enemies within Helldivers 2, because I think the entire system behind it is really important to know and understand if you want to go further into the difficulties of the game. And also, there's a little bug in the game for the automations, but I'll get to that later in the video. But before we jump into the video, I want to thank you all for helping me on this channel. I did a stratagem, Tyre, I know it's pronounced Tyre, but there's a meme within it. And if you've seen the video, you know what I'm talking about. But yeah, thank you all for just blowing up the channel. That video right now is about to reach 70,000 views. So yeah, get me partnering here. Thank you. With that out of the way, let's jump into the juicy content of this video. The spawn mechanics is the same for both the Terminates and the Automatrons. And just to make it easier for me to explain what is going on with the spawns in the game, I will refer to them being the heat, or the map heat, in this video. When you start out on a mission, you will obviously start with the lowest map heat that there is. And then over time, it will build up until a maximum threshold is reached. And then it will stay there until the mission is either success or failure. Map heat that there is. And then over time, it will build up until being the heat, or the map heat, in this video. You start out on a mission, you will obviously start with the lowest map heat that there is. And then over time, it will build up until a maximum threshold is reached. And then it will stay there until the mission is either success or failure. Before we talk more about the map heap, let's talk about what sort of different enemy spawns that there is in the game. You have the static spawns that will linger on a specific spot on the map. Engaging on these doesn't have any effect on your map heap. Then you have the reinforcements that will spawn in on main objectives, such as during the primary objectives or the extraction. Is in the game. You have the static spawns that will linger on a specific spot on the map. Engaging on these doesn't have any effect on your map heap. Different enemy spawns that there is in the game. You have the static spawns that will linger on a specific spot on the map. Engaging on these doesn't have any effect on your map heap.
Let us rally to our defense.
Then you have the reinforcements that will spawn in on main objectives, such as during the primary objectives or the extraction. Then we have the spawns and the nests. This goes for light, medium, heavy, and stalkers nests. Lastly, you have the patrols. The patrols will spawn in whenever the map heat hits a certain threshold. The heat will work as a tick that goes up every second. Every tick goes into, let's say, a bucket, just to visualize it for you. And then when the bucket is filled, a new patrol will spawn. The bucket will be emptied by the spawn of this patrol, and then the entire process goes on again. When the patrol spawns, it'll move across the location you were when it spawned. If you manage to move from that location, then therefore not engage in combat with it, it'll keep on moving through the map and eventually despawn. This means that the more map heap you generate, the more patrols will spawn and move towards your location. So that leaves us with the question: how does the map heap build up? Let's start with going over the things that doesn't affect the map heap. Time spent in mission. Yes, that's right. This came as a surprise for me as well. Engaging combat. Stratagem usage. Breaches or butt drops. The planet you pick. Mission type. Being in proximity of points of interest. Using terminal or interacting with the objective elements. Completion of secondary objectives. With all these things that doesn't affect the map heap, let's dive into what does affect it. Primary objectives. Primary sub-objectives. Secondary objectives. Enemy outposts. That'll be the Terminates' nests or the Automatrons' outposts. However, keep in mind that the light ones do not affect it. Lastly, we have the extraction point activation. The closer you are to one of these objectives, the more heat you can create. Let me give... You start out on a mission, you will obviously start on the lowest map heap that there is. And then over the map heap, let's talk about what sort of different enemy spawns that there is in the game. We have the static spawns that will linger on a specific spot on the map. Engaging on these doesn't have any effect on your map heap. Then you have the reinforcements that will spawn in on main objectives, such as doing the primary objectives or the extraction. Then we have the spawns and the nests. This goes for light, medium, heavy, and stalkers nests. Lastly, you have the patrols. The patrols will spawn in whenever the map heat hits a certain threshold. The heat will work as a tick that goes up every second. Every tick goes into, let's say, a bucket, just to visualize it for you. And then when the bucket is filled, a new patrol will spawn. The bucket will be emptied by the spawn of this patrol, and the entire process goes on again. When the patrol spawns, it will move across the location to where when it spawned. If you manage to move from that location, then therefore not engaging combat with it, it'll keep on moving through the map. It spawns, it'll move across the location to where when it spawned. If you manage to move from that location, then therefore not engaging combat with
Let
it,
us rally to her defense.
process goes on again. When the patrol spawns, it'll move across the location to where when it spawned. If you manage to move from that location, then therefore not engaging combat with it, it'll keep on moving through the map and eventually despawn. This means that the more map hit you generate, the more patrol will spawn and move towards your location. So that leaves us with the question, how does the map heat build up? Let's start with going over the things that doesn't affect the map heat. Time spent in mission. Yes, that's right. This came as a surprise from this one. Engaging combat. Stratagem usage. Breaches. Map heat. Time spent in mission. Yes, that's right. This came as a surprise from this one. Engaging combat. Strategy. The more patrol will spawn and move towards your location. So that leaves us with the question, how does the map heat build up? Let's start with going over the things that doesn't affect the map heat. Time spent in mission. Yes, that's right. This came as a surprise from this one. Engaging combat. Stratagem usage. Breaches or butt drops. The planet you pick. Mission type, being in proximity of points of interest, using terminal or interacting with objective elements, completion of secondary objectives. With all these things that doesn't affect the map heat, let's dive into what does affect it. Primary objectives, primary sub-objectives, secondary objectives, enemy outposts, that'll be the Terminates nests or the automations outposts, primary sub-objectives, secondary objectives, enemy outposts, that'll be the Terminates nests or the automations outposts. However, keep in mind that the light ones do not affect it. Lastly, we have the extraction point activation. The closer you are to one of these objectives, the more heat you can create. Let me give you an example. If I'm within 50 meters of the objective, I'll generate 100% heat of what is available. If I'm at 100 meters of the objectives, I'll be generating 50% of the max heat. And if I'm within 125 meters of the objectives, then I'll be generating 25% of what the max heat available is. The heat generation can never exceed the maximum threshold, and every player has his own heat bucket. But when all players are close together, they will be calculated as one bucket instead of four. This means that when you're fighting the same objective, you want to stay close together to limit the heat being generated. Let me elaborate on that. If you have 3 players moving within 75 meters of each other's, then they are one bucket. But the 4th member is 100 meters away from the 3 others, then he will be generating a second bucket, which means he'll be doubling the amount of spawns from the map heat. And this keeps on going up, so if all 4 players are split in between with 75 or 100 meters in between them, then you can actually quadruple the spawns of the enemies because you now have 4 pockets at the same time. Talking about the squad size also have an impact upon how much heat can be generated on the map, and therefore also how fast the enemies will spawn in. What the values of this is, I do not know. What is the most efficient way to complete a mission? When you drop into a mission, you want to start out by farming up all the map materials while taking care of nests on the map. That being light, medium, and even the heavy nests. When engaging on a nest or an outpost, you want to be moving close together to try and prolong the bucket's threshold filling up faster. The nests will generate heat, but they will only go as far as 50% of the max map heat threshold, and then it will linger there until you start progressing the main objectives. This will give you enough breathing room to gather up all the extras on the map, and depending on the extraction location, you might even be able to run by it and drop off all the materials so they'll be sitting there waiting for you to go and activating the extraction. When that bug I talked about in the start of the video about the automatrons, apparently some patrols within the automatron materials so they'll be sitting there waiting for you to go and activating the extraction point. When that bug I talked about, and depending on the extraction location, you might even be able to run by it and drop off all the materials so they'll be sitting there waiting for you to go and activating the extraction point. When that bug I talked about in the start of the video about the automatrons, apparently some patrols within the automatron, the nests will generate heat, but they will only go as far as 50% of the max map heat threshold, and then it will linger there until you start progressing the main objectives. This will give you enough breathing room to gather up all the extras on the map, and depending on the extraction location, you might even be able to run by it and drop off all the materials so they'll be sitting there waiting for you to go and activating the extraction point. When that bug I talked about in the start of the video about the automatrons, apparently some patrols within the automatron planets tend to walk directly to the middle of the map, and then they will stay there and never despawn. So do yourself a favor when playing those missions, and never go to the middle of the map.
Helldivers.
All
The
is in
Super Destroyer is ready for your next mission.
directly to the middle of the map, and then they will stay there and never despawn. So do yourself a favor when playing those missions, and never go to the middle of the map. All this information is something I've gathered up by my own testing with my squad after reading a post on Reddit made from Gurgi Nation. I'll put a link for the post down in the comments. So huge thanks to him for testing this out. And I can back him up after my own testing. What he's talking about here is spot on. I hope this insight of the mechanics of the all this information is something I've gathered up by my own testing with my squad after reading a post on Reddit made from Gurgi Nation. I'll put a link for the post down in the comments. So huge thanks to him for testing this out. And I can back him up after my own testing. What he's talking about here is spot on. I hope this insight of the mechanics of the spawns in the game is going to be helping you out a little bit. It certainly helped me out a ton in the game. Just the fact that the map timer doesn't have any effect on the spawns on the enemies is huge for me. Because when we start out a mission now, we tend to use all the time we can just running around, gathering everything we need to gather before we go into doing the main objectives. This also means that when it comes to calling in the mech suits, we save them until the end of the mission, because that is where all the heat is going to be taking place, and we need that extra fire support in the game. If you have any insights towards what I just talked about, then let us know in the comments, and hey, thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. If there's anything you want me to cover specifically about Helldivers 2, then let me know, and I will look into it. If you're searching for a community to play Helldivers 2 with, then feel free to hit the Discord or come over to Twitch and see me over there. I tend to play with the viewers whenever I got the time for it. You can find the links for it down there. And that leaves us with only one thing to say. May you succeed or retreat to Valhalla. Take care. Goodbye.
is one of nature's most violent forces. Within an instant, upwards of 300 million volts strikes a grounding point. If this point is a living being, the chances of survival are slim. So what happens when the brave scientists of Super Earth channel a fraction of that energy into a large rifle? Well, we get the arc thrower. This stratagem is becoming well known as one of the most underrated support weapons in the game, and I'm almost certain it is seen as an underdog because many divers have experienced an unexpected and fatal shot from none other than their own squad mate. Has this happened to you? Well, I'm going to show you not only how to complete a mission with no friendly fire damage, which skyrockets its usefulness, but we will also go through its strengths, weaknesses, and quirks, so you can drop that railgun and give the arc thrower a try. Before we dive in, following my Eagle video, which you can check out in the top right, I'll be covering the orbital strikes as soon as I've gathered enough samples to test all of the upgrades. And I may be revisiting the Eagle's 110mm rocket pods as well, as many of you swear by them. So drop a sub to stay tuned. But for now, into the arc thrower. Right off the bat, we need to understand how the projectile itself works so we can avoid hurting our fellow divers. The Vault always aims for the center mass of its target, no matter which direction you aim. So to aim for headshots, your target needs to be facing you. If a diver is out in front of you, you should ensure you fire around them at a sufficient distance, whereby the shots won't arc towards the player. This is fairly easy to do, as it essentially means we don't fire when a player is directly in front of you. The second part is understanding how the chaining mechanic works, so you can avoid hitting an ally with a chained hit. These chains can jump up to 3 times in total and will never jump backwards towards you, so if you fire at a target, any units in front of it will not be hit as well. Only units within roughly a 180-degree cone behind the primary target will be potential targets for chained hits. And this same mechanic extends to each enemy hit by each chain, meaning if your squad mate is between you and your target and you can get a clear shot, you will not risk hurting. This essentially forces you to be aware of everyone's positioning at all times, which is a good thing anyway. The arc will also bounce between sentries, mechs, inanimate objects, and some dead bodies as well, which is something to be aware of when using the weapon. Another thing to note before we move on to the damage this thing can deliver is to avoid using this weapon in first person unless you really enjoy it and are used to it. This stops you from being able to visually manage how much the weapon has charged via the reticle, leaving you to do this entirely through the audio. Charge management is going to be very important when it comes to our effective DPS with this weapon, as once you have fully charged the weapon once, you do not have to charge it fully for subsequent shots afterwards, unless you hesitate or pause shooting. You can fire at a rate of approximately 1.2 shots per second, rather than 1 shot per second for fully charged shots, which only sounds a little, but in-game, as you can see, is actually quite a lot over time. This is an important mechanic to learn to maximize your DPS with the weapon. Now, let's go through exactly where this weapon is an absolute beast. That is, in Terminid territory. This thing absolutely deletes almost every target without breaking a sweat. I'll preface this with the fact that you will get the most damage for a front-on shot on most of these enemies. Once you start hitting bugs on the side or behind, with the exception of the charger, time to kill can become very inconsistent. Front-on, it can kill all scavenger, warrior and hunter type enemies in 1 shot, and stalkers, bile spewers and brood commanders in 2 or 3.
The Mafia, Italians, Irish, Russians, Jews, Mexicanos. Throughout U.S. history, every minority group in America has established a formidable mafia at one time. Except one. The Germans. So why was there never a German mafia in American history? You may have never noticed, the lack of a German mafia is a curious gap in American history, as logically it definitely should exist. You see, between 1840 and 1890, the Germans were the largest single ethnic group immigrating to the United States. For over 50 years, millions of Germans washed ashore in New York and Boston like algae overgrowing a warm lake. Indeed, during several key battles of the U.S. Civil War, native Germans speaking zero English filled out entire regiments in the Union Army, the 52nd of New York, 9th of Iowa, and 74th Pennsylvania, to name just a few. So vast were the waves of German bodies crashing on America's shores every year that of approximately 516,000 Union soldiers, 200,000 were born in the German Confederation. And after the war, it did not stop. Between between 1880 and 1890, another 1,500,000 Germans immigrated to the U.S., by this time forcing the Garfield administration to grapple assimilating the largest share of foreign-born people in the United States in her entire history. Only 3 years later, by 1903, over 800 German-language journals were being printed in the United States every month. It may seem hard to believe now, but more Germans fled Europe for America than Irish and Italians combined. By 1930, 1 in 10 U.S. citizens were German Americans, and mafias had spread their roots deep into American society. You see, at the dawn of the 20th century, there were many lucrative mafias, including the Kosher Nostra, Italian, Kosher Nostra, Jewish, that's mobsters, Irish, the Purple Gang, Jewish, West Side Mob, Irish, and the infamous Russian Mafia. Bingo. However, crucially, the word was sauerkraut kids. Despite vast, overwhelming immigration and a shared sense of cultural identity, or language at least, Germans never developed a mafia in the United States. Why? Well, the answer is unclear. It's never been studied. ChatGPT won't give you a good answer. However, from our investigation, German-American immigrants can be divided into 2 categories. During the 19th century, when millions of German seekers were traveling to the New World, the majority were Southern Germans from rural farms, while a minority were Northern German political exiles, like the 48ers. And once they arrived in the U.S., rather than settling in port cities in New York and Boston, like their European comrades, they instead chose to move largely west of the Appalachian. Germans chose farming in newly created states like Ohio, Indiana, and Wisconsin. This unique decision led early Germans to live largely excluded from America's new developing industrial city life. And as the Germans primarily worked on large farms, it meant new German immigrants lived large physical distances from other German immigrants. And this trend continued well into the 1900s, until many rural towns were primarily German-speaking and culturally Protestant. A map of demographics in 2023 shows how this unique German migration pattern birthed and primarily shaped what we now call the American Midwest, a region culturally distinct from other parts of America. While Irish and Italian Americans densely clustered around Boston, Russian Jews set up in New York and later Florida, Germans at the time chose to spread thinly over a vast area of the Republic. This decentralized life made it less likely a family or families seized power instead of a centralized economic structure like the mafia.
Found something!
Additionally, because Germans and other Europeans earned their living farming and rural trade far away from the epicenter of American industry, it's likely they didn't experience the extreme levels of discrimination their Irish and Italian brothers did, like being cut out of labor jobs. Therefore, they likely felt less of a necessity to organize into hierarchies like the Italians and Irish did in order to open illicit businesses where they could earn a living in the city and provide for their families. The more libertarian markets of gambling, drug running, prostitution, and racketeering. But finally, the total lack of a German mafia could rest on perception. As outside Chicago, all major American cities during the Gilded Age were located on the East Coast. And since metropolitan life took place far away from the heartland, what nefarious activities did occur 1,000 miles away on the Great Lakes or Great Plains were of little concern to the average American, let alone the wealthy, prior to the automobile, telephone, or radio. It's likely any German criminal organization that did occur went less documented by newspapers and police, as at the time, these institutions existed mainly in large cities, where the Irish, Italians, Jews were already attracting focus and operating. Indeed, almost as a corollary to the millions of poor Germans settling the Midwest, the rich, educated Germans did prefer the cities. People like Albert Einstein, Fritz Lang, Marlene Dietrich, Hans Hofmann, Walter Gropius, Kurt Weill, Franz Boas, Max Weber. Again, however, these German immigrants faced less discrimination in earning a living, as they were able to write or teach for a living rather than forced to sell their labor. Over time, this meant the German-American organization that did occur in the United States was often frequently more political than economic, of a mafia in nature. By the 1930s, German-American thinkers and writers had more time to unify their brethren on political or scientific causes. Teaching physics at the University of Chicago, brewing beer in Milwaukee, or stepping in New York City. Ironically, in a karmic twist of fate, in the U.S., it was the Jewish mafia that beat Germans senseless during Adolf Hitler's rise to power. American Bund. The Bund thrived as a national organization that supported Adolf Hitler and pledged allegiance to the new Reich. And on a crisp day in October 1938, many American Nazis marched excitedly to a rally on New York's East Side, the heart of the historic German town in New York City. After the American boom and Nazi rally finished, members gathered into a swastika-laden ballroom to hear how Kuhn, fervent Hitler supporter, delivered what would have been, I'm sure, a provoking speech. But it never happened. According to news reports at the time, Mr. Mayor Lansky and his friends, along with a group called Murder Inc., quietly arrived at the rally and surrounded the building. As Kuhn gathered his notes to give his talk, 5 Jewish gangsters pushed forward the second floor, while 5 more waited outside with pool cues and baseball bats. In the back of the room, Mr. Lansky and his Jewish men entered, listened briefly to the Nazi speech, and then unleashed mayhem. A first-hand witness of the event said men who knew how to march were fighting men who knew how to hurt. Quickly scattered about lay injured Nazis everywhere. Some lay unconscious from being pulled to the head. The gangsters' only agreement with the New York police was apparently not to kill anyone, a goal they only barely accomplished. After beating one Kuhn member semi-conscious, members of Murder Inc. tossed the man out the second-story window. It seems farming and philosophy would only take German Americans so far in his life. So the absent German mafia in American history is a curious question without a single answer. Nonetheless, German immigrants' unique migration patterns and economic background, being mainly farmers, thinkers, or Nazis, rather than laborers, likely led to less of a need for organized crime, therefore a German mafia. If you found this video as interesting as I did researching it, please like and subscribe. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.
I've got to say, after over 20 years since Helldivers introduction, where they are all based from different this alternate using all so however strikes back with a move called Santoryu or style Kokoba Madaragari. This is a continuation of his Gari or Han series attacks. His first move was Toragari or Tiger Han, which was then part up to full Toragari or Ultra Tiger Han. Then he had Katagari or Han. And finally here we have Kokoba Madaragari. Kokoba refers to one of the moves associated with the tiger, thus continuing the theme. Zoro's larger theming with attacks and Buddhism line. Madaragari refers to the spot of leopard as seen as well, meaning that Zoro is focused on a Buddhist Madara attack, referring to leopard spots by hunting down a leopard himself. Thus, the attack could be translated as Tiger Hell spotted leopard hunts. Going back to the first say though, same Tapman war community is now based on the Japanese is called swine seal is described as a colossal or creature of massive proportions. It bears 4 large tusks, sometimes very body is clad in fire, representing the place, burning, and villages. These are working notably large mustache by turning it into large tusks, of which there seem to be more in total, just these birthmarks on its head seem to have been adopted into the pattern of his body. Saint Ethan Baron Vina Suzuro can transform into the dead horse. In Japanese, it is called by the translated name of Mahut, which literally just means skeleton horse, and widely refers to these skeletal horses from different developments.
Mission at 30 minutes remaining.
A fairly obscure yokai that is called a skeleton horse or Mahotsu, but in this case in particular, I think Oda is inspired largely by skeleton horse also known as the dead horse, the pale horse, reaper horse, or skeleton horse. I think that Oda seems to have used now mostly of the pale horse of death, or horse of the apocalypse. line to Midori's Sandai belongs, make the third iteration of the line, Sandai Sword. Thus, many fans have speculated that the sword could be the Shodai Kitetsu, which was mentioned before in the story and was said to be the original of the first sword line and one of the Saijo Owazamono, the 12 strongest blades in the entire world, standing on the same level as Mihawk's Yoru, Whitebeard's Urakumogiri, and Roger's Ace. So it would make a lot of sense that one of the Gorosei, being such a mighty warrior, would bear this historical blade, one of the greatest ever forged, and a cursed blade as well, fitting with someone that is embodying death itself. And finally, the last of the Gorosei, Shane the Shepherd Jupiter, can transform into the Sandworm. The Sandworm is a creature that has similarly existed in different mythologies, though its more prevalent depiction is the Death Worm, a demonic creature of Mongolian mythology said to have prowled the sands of the Gobi Desert since times of old. The Sandworm, however, has been more widely adopted in modern mythology through its interpretation in the classic Grecian novel of Dune by Frank Herbert, who cited dragons and myths of other demonic worms and worms, having inspired in what is the modern interpretation of the sandworms, even beyond the alien second of Dune, are depicted as worms of colossal proportions. Its depiction here in One Piece is quite similar to that of the original depiction of the sandworm of Dune, more like its future movie counterparts have been mounted close by 4 rings, which open to show a large one. In the original Mongolian myth, sandworms are incredibly poisonous, able to cause death upon the first touch, which could potentially apply here. And in its modern depictions, they have the ability to burrow underground like worms, but due to their colossal size, they are able to make gigantic tunnels and move about at very meaning that they can strike at any time from anywhere. The fact he burrows into the ground as a worm is quite fitting for the Gorosei that he is the war god of agriculture, literally tapping to the soil. In this case, we see it in action by burrowing into the ground and suddenly appearing to swallow Luffy. However, Dorian Brogy slice clean through Jupiter, though this likely won't amount to much since he got the move they use is called Aito Noku, which translates to Sun Saw or Solar Saw, essentially cutting in the shape of the sun. Or this is unsurprisingly a pun, as Taiyo no Ko can also be read as Child of the Sun, referring likely to Luffy himself, the Sun God. This entire scene is a callback to the first encounter between Luffy and Dory, where Luffy was swallowed by a Brontosaurus, Dory cut his head off, only to fall out. When comparing the silhouettes of the Gorosei in chapter 1085 to the present, you can clearly see how they match. We can spot Saturn's horns, as well as the outline of his spiral legs, Mars's wings, and Mercury's bored tusks. Nasujuro appeared to be humanoid, but this is because he was likely in his hybrid form, with only the top half of his center body being visible in that panel. Similarly, Jupiter was sustained by a lot of people that above, who is actually without feet, which are not being particularly visible in this shot, but this is because, as a worm, he was around, so it makes sense why he wasn't there. And in the next shot, Jupiter appeared with an open mouth, which makes sense when the sandworm built this particular former self. Yet for how cool all of these forms may seem, there is one key aspect about them that may pose yet another reveal of series changing proportions, and that is the name of their downloads. Because as an example, the name of Saturn's moon is that's it. There is no Kumokumonomi model or spider's spider. It's just but literally just now you could argue that maybe Oda felt lazy at based on I don't know names, but still find that to be too unlikely. Why would Oda not bother giving them already has the have a cloud scarf around their necks, which is a symbol of a transformed awakened Zoan. They appear to have human forms, but also their hybrid forms and full beast forms, which we've already seen for both Nazishuro and Sarah. But think about it this way. What if the Gorosei have these forms and these rules, not because they are Delphin users, but what if Delphin users were modeled after these forms? Their powers aren't normal to begin with. They can literally summon each other, have infinite regeneration, and beyond their Zord forms, they have this fourth dark blob of forms that resemble those that you can transform into. A form that isn't fully transformed, but is this sort of like cosmic devilish entity. After all, with evil being widely speculated to be the origin of Delphins, it would make sense if you could confer the Gorosei special powers, ones that are in the form of Delphins. You know, they have still the same hybrid form, normal form, and transformed form, but aren't foods. They aren't limited by devil foods. They are literally actual devils made by evil himself. And that the devil foods, in the end, would just be a way to replicate these devil powers, but instead in the form of fruits, which grant these powers but in a more restricted form. In fact, what if the Gorosei are maybe not even weak to water to begin with? What if one of them falls into the sea but it can still swim? Where do these possibilities end? Seeing this demonic side of the world, it's evident. These are devils, extensions of evil and demonic beings that stand at the top of the world and manipulate it to the creator's will. The more we learn about the Gorosei, the more we learn about evil and the larger mysteries of the story. It's just as Sabo himself said, who knew that hell was located at the top of the world.
Tagging map. East. Close.
Bug tunnel breach!
Follow me. Supply.
Requesting air support! Tagging location.
All Forces videos are available early, ad-free, and uncensored on Patreon. Patrons also get access to exclusive videos, merch giveaways, and more. Check it out at patreon.com/Forces.
Well,
Forces is an independent creative project that relies on the support of viewers like you. Thank you.
Mission at 20 minutes
Here,
remaining.
low-cost
Requesting
book
objective equipment north.
is a story of abuse, misinformation, and unfathomable.
Calling in orbital strike!
But so often the work has been interpreted, manipulated, and maligned in a way distant and remarkably from the original
got
source
equipment.
material. Whether you have read Lolita or not, examining the book and
Package
its
acquired.
long-standing cultural impact is a tremendous exercise.
Tagging map.
It is a
Southeast.
case
200
study
meters.
in how we manipulate media, how media can manipulate us, and beneath all of that, we can find the true horror of Nabokov's novel. Lolita tells the story of a man who manipulates, kidnaps, and repeatedly rapes a 12-year-old girl as her stepfather. The book is presented as a memoir written. Lolita tells the story of a man who manipulates, kidnaps, and repeatedly rapes a 12-year-old girl as her stepfather. The book is presented as a memoir written in the first-person perspective by a man under the pseudonym Humbert.
Dropping
Man
package.
recalls that as a child he fell in love with a girl named Annabelle. Before this romance developed into anything meaningful, Annabelle died of typhus. Humbert claims that this was the genesis of his erotic and romantic obsession with young girls. At the age of 37, Humbert meets a recently widowed woman named Charlotte. She is looking for someone to lodge in her home, and Humbert, out of place to stay, agrees to her rescue. During the visit, he meets Charlotte's 12-year-old daughter, Dolores. He describes Dolores as a perfect nymphet and moves in with Charlotte only as a means to protect her daughter. Charlotte dies, and Humbert proceeds to kidnap Dolores, who he has nicknamed Lolita. Humbert drives with Dolores across the United States, regularly molesting her throughout the story. Eventually, Dolores leaves Humbert to be with another older man named Claire Quilty. Dolores refuses to be in a pornographic film
Calling in an
Claire is
orbital strike.
producing and eventually leaves him as well.
Later in the story, Humbert kills Claire and is arrested for murder. Dolores marries another man before eventually dying in childbirth. This is a very basic but accurate synopsis of Lolita. However, to truly understand the book and understand how the world basically failed Lolita, we must analyze the work more comprehensively.
Bugs, southeast.
First step in understanding Lolita is understanding Humbert. Specifically, we must realize that Humbert is an unreliable narrator, perhaps not in the traditional sense. The typical unreliable narrator says things that aren't true, recounts events that didn't happen. Everything Humbert says in Lolita did happen, but we are only seeing his interpretation of those events. As an aggressive, violent pedophile, Humbert is inclined to find sexual advances or sexual tension from Dolly where there is none. The entire story is told through the lens of Humbert and his sexual proclivities. So Humbert himself may not even realize that he is an unreliable narrator, but that is immaterial. The fact is this: Humbert does not provide an objective account of the events in Lolita. We know this partially through Humbert's framing of the tale. He confesses to, at time of writing, having been shipped from insane asylum to insane asylum during and after the story. Throughout the tale, Humbert makes multiple visits to sanatoriums, which produce no positive results for his mental health. In one passage, he admits that after a hospitalization, he had, quote, another bout with insanity. Additionally, he regularly tricks psychiatrists into making faulty assessments of his sexuality. So we can say with certainty that Humbert is psychologically unstable. This already calls into question his account of events. Even more egregious, Lolita shows us that Humbert is also a habitual, perhaps even pathological, liar. In one instance, he tells another character that he has begun a love affair with Dolly's mother, Charlotte. But he also tells the reader that he only moved in with Charlotte to get closer to Dolly, which is in itself an act of dishonesty. Humbert later applies Dolores to a private school with her father. Throughout Lolita, Humbert's dishonesty is regularly on full display. Furthermore, Humbert's memoir is written as Humbert's defense for a jury. This is the context in which the book exists within its universe. At the time of writing, Humbert is on trial for murder. If anyone had reason to lie, it would be such a person. Humbert's memory is also shown to be remarkably inconsistent. In one instance, he claims to have a, quote, incomplete and unorthodox memory. But throughout the book, Humbert recalls certain scenes with near photographic completeness. Others, meanwhile, are vague, blurred, and haphazardly narrated. We could say this is just the nature of recollection. Everyone has an unreliable memory. This criticism, though, only furthers Humbert's position as unreliable. Because his memory is our sole source of knowledge, we must recognize that what we are reading is inherently unreliable. Here we may be tempted to chalk much of this up to Nabokov's writing. Nabokov, who wrote the first words, Humbert is a fictional person. His words are not really his own. We should acknowledge that Nabokov is a masterful author. The construction of the chaotic Humbert is very simple. Nabokov felt so compelled to make this clear that he actually penned a short essay called On a Book, Lolita. In this essay, he states that he does not share Humbert's moral Humbert is not a book. He is a carefully constructed character designed to manipulate the reader's obstacle as we will see. So, with all of that in mind, and that there is further complicating things, we should realize that Lolita presents us with basically Humbert, the narrator, the actor. The things which Humbert says very often do not match up with the things he has done. In a reader's guide to Nabokov's Lolita, this is the chronicles in great detail without justification. The narrator, Humbert, recounts the events of his memoir. He describes himself and the role he played in the so-called relationship. Of course, Humbert is from his own perspective, albeit that and horrifically warped at worst. First, we will examine the narrator, Humbert, so that we may then remove his mask and meet the monster who truly is Humbert. Both in will take a pause to investigate an earlier piece of Russian literature, Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. In this book, the main character believes he is somehow elevated above the rules of man, that there are remarkable individuals to whom convention does not apply. This character commits a murder based on this idea. Nabokov's Humbert follows much in this same template as he describes his ostensible discovery.
Enemy tactical asset within threat range.
Humbert attempts to convince us that he is somehow elevated above regular man by virtue of his pedophilia. To identify a effect of the sort he likes, Humbert says that a person must be an artist and a madman. Humbert goes on to describe in flowery detail what qualifies a young girl as a man that fashions himself as something a connoisseur and an artist. He tries to align himself with creative greats like the author Dante, that Dante fell in love with a 9-year-old girl named Beatrice. Here, Humbert fails to mention that Dante himself was 9. Humbert claims that nymphets are another sex altogether, somehow male. Takes a very scientific tone as he describes them, and concluding that he is only a few other select individuals are capable of recognizing the species. Essentially, he is paralyzed his own pedophilia. He further aligns his infatuation with dubious historical context. He says it is a natural desire that it is a societal concept prohibited a man from falling in love with a girl. He points to the customs of ancient Rome and Egypt and says that modern society alone doesn't allow him to, quote, court a girl as well. Of course, Humbert does not support the knowledge. The narrator also attempts to provide a psychological justification for his fetish. He says that childhood romance was interrupted by Annabelle's death and that Dolly could now fill that void. He frames Dolly as someone special, implying that she alone has some place in his heart. But we also know that up until he met Dolly, Humbert sated his twisted sexual desires by watching the sex of his heart. In fact, time and time again, Humbert waxes erotic about teenage girls. So it seems that other than actually fulfilling his fantasy, there is very little that is special about Dolly. In one of his more remarkably flimsy arguments, Humbert also claims that his desires are a matter of art rather than criminal pursuit. Of course, we could always read that intent in this case is completely irrelevant. One morning, Humbert engages with
Request
Dolly in
approved.
3 rounds of,
Reinforcements
quote,
have been launched.
strenuous phrase which screams rape and like the back of this mission, Humbert's narrator shows himself quite clearly. He clings to herself remorse. He felt as if he was sitting next to the ghost of someone who just exists. Poetic, certainly, but then follows the 200 pages of Humbert kidnapping and molesting. Whatever grief he claims to feel, it was apparently quite shallow. Humbert concludes, bizarrely, that he is a good man and that he, quote, had the utmost respect for ordinary children, their purity, vulnerability, and under no circumstance would he have interfered with the innocence of a child, if there was the least risk of a rat. So here, Humbert proclaims he would never hurt the child, with the qualifier of if he was caught. It is then the punishment rather than the act which Humbert finds disagreeable. Humbert later makes the statement that he only wanted to give Dolly a good time. On the back of this claim, we can examine the actor Humbert, not the man who recounted events, but the man who actually performed them. The truth is quite clear. Dolly did not have a good time. No human of reasonable intellect could honestly claim such a thing. Humbert is a violent and sexual abuser. In one instant, Humbert brings himself to orgasm while sitting next to Dolly on the couch. The narrator Humbert claims she felt nothing at all, but the events described indicate otherwise. The girl shrieks, cheekbones flush. She squirms helplessly while Humbert touches her. Humbert later describes this as no harm is done. We need not describe in detail every kiss and sexual interaction between the two, but suffice to say, sexual gratification alone is Humbert's driving motivation. At this point, actor Humbert makes it clear that he has no
Allied
interest in
destroyer
Dolly
has left
as
the
a
squadron.
name. Lolita was not Dolly's name, not in the slightest. No one in Dolores' life ever called her Lolita. By anointing her as Lolita, Humbert acted with confessing that he took little interest in the non-sexual Dolly, but rather declaring that Dolly herself is somehow to blame for forbidding him from doing so. Humbert actually expresses regular disdain for Dolly. He calls her a brat and describes her regular, quote, fits of disorganized boredom and vehement griping. Humbert says she is droopy and dopey-eyed. He further describes her as a disgustingly conventional little girl. Throughout the book, Humbert claims to be in love with Dolly, but clearly this is false. Furthermore, Humbert is a manipulator. It is his careful manipulation to tell the story forward in which drive Dolly to his arms. Dolly, Humbert says, is quite infatuated with glamour and exotic ideas of celebrities and movies. Humbert is from Europe, and in some way says that he may possess a version of this exotic appeal to Dolly. In fact, Dolly has a crush on a famous playwright who Humbert himself is said to resemble, or at least Humbert claims. Humbert uses this knowledge to encourage Dolly's maturity to escalate their early relationship.
Allied destroyer joining squadron, deploying
When Dolly's mother dies, Humbert continually withholds this news from the girl. His plan is rather to exploit the information which may gain some sexual gratification out of her reaction. Throughout the story, Humbert also employs several methods to keep his, quote, pubescent concubine in submission. He tells her that without him, Dolly would be locked up in some government institution. As he kidnaps her and drives Dolly around the country, Humbert refuses to let her speak with anyone other than himself. Humbert also pays Dolly for obliging his sexual advances. He offers her 3 cents a day for fulfilling, quote, basic obligations. When she begins to demand more, Humbert calls the request a definite drop in morals. In one instance, he hands her the coins only to pry her hands open and take them back. Beyond Dolly,
5
Humbert
minutes
also
left.
attempts to
Liberty speaker,
manipulate
step,
the reader.
Helldiver.
As we read Lolita, we find ourselves disgustingly charmed by Humbert's prose. Nabokov hurls all of his talent at Humbert's explanation for pedophilia. We certainly and hopefully do not agree with anything he says, but the passion in which he delivers it is dangerously artful and charismatic. The book, again, is framed as an argument to a jury, as if Humbert will eventually present this as his case. So as we read Lolita, there are 3 audiences in the room: Humbert himself, the jury, and the reader. Humbert tries to ally himself with the reader. The jurors, he is cold and condescending. When he addresses the reader, he is jovial and comedic. So his memoir is littered with snide remarks about frigid gentlewomen of the jury, or facetious, mocking appeals to a group of jurors. These remarks are meant as a sort of wink-wink to the reader, establishing a jovial rapport that he hopes will gloss over his depravity. He repeatedly addresses the reading audience as learned reader, as if to flatter and foster this positive rapport. Humbert also claims the reader is patient and meek in comparison to Dolly. This serves to simultaneously flatter the reader and denigrate Dolly's character, pulling the audience to Humbert's side. Lolita is an undeniably comedic book, thanks to Humbert's prose. It was lauded for its humor upon first publication. Humbert is self-deprecating. He calls himself Humbert the Terrible. He says he is stupid, monstrous, or bestial, clearly to assuage the sympathy of the reader. Humbert also pokes fun at their
Extraction shuttle inbound.
writing remarks which forward-thinking readers would very likely have agreed with. In one instance, Humbert implores the reader to check the weather data so as to prove the veracity of an incident he is recounting. Presumably, this assuredness is meant to convince the reader that Humbert is reliable. His recollection lines up with documented reality. Of course, one instance of this being true should not be extended to the rest of the pages. What does the weather have to do with the lesson?
ETA T-minus 1 minute 30 seconds.
Humbert, towards the end of the book, claims to have changed, that he is actually in love with Dolly, and that he regrets the way he treated her. Given all that we have learned, I find this tremendously difficult. Some readers may disagree. But to examine Humbert, to examine
Orbital strike incoming.
we must turn our attention to Dolly herself. Humbert is primarily interested in Dolly as a physical specimen, so the only solid information we have about her is just that, her physical appearance. Humbert discusses this at great length numerous times throughout the book. Frankly, the ambivalent towards her mother, and
Eagle
Humbert
1,
claims
returning
she
to
has no
destroyer
kids
for
towards
resupply.
Humbert. Humbert cynically says she is
Minus 10
an ideal
seconds.
consumer who fall for every advertisement and billboard. Indeed, Humbert's assessment of Dolly's plainness and light is drawn from her, rather than taking her as an individual with unique thoughts or feelings. Humbert sees Dolly as an idea. She is an adolescent girl. Often people have accused Nabokov of misogyny with they say that Dolly is a seductress who was given no other role than physical fulfillment for Humbert. But to say this, they should side with Humbert. Every time Humbert describes Dolly's actions, he takes great pain to imbue them with some sensuality and tempting
initiated. Stand by for
He molests her on the couch, and Humbert says she gives him an orgasm.
Extraction
Humbert
complete.
drugs her
One
and
beginning
tries to
ascent.
rape her, yet it is somehow Dolly who seduces him. She holds an apple, and Humbert describes it as Eden red. Humbert confesses to a past sexual experience in summer camp. For this, Humbert categorizes her as an experienced temptress. When the book was originally published, many critics were quick to side with Humbert. One critic, Dorothy Parker, wrote that Dolly was a, quote, dreadful little, selfish, hard, vulgar, and foul-tempered. Another reader wondered in an article if he was meant to pity Dolly before concluding, she is a spoiled sub-teenager with a foul mouth, self-offered target for lectures, movie magazine editors, and corrupt classmates. In addition to Humbert's laborious prose, this impression likely does come from events in the story. Dolly seems to enjoy his early attention. Dolly actively engages, awkwardly and by coercion, in flirtations and sexual experiments with Humbert at first. But when Humbert drugs